and welcome to Informally Formal. Today's topic is very interesting but complicated at the same time. And there's just a handful of people that are capable of explaining this very interesting and complicated topic. We're going to be talking about industrial protection, pros and cons. So it goes hand in hand with industrial policy. Some call it protectionism, what have you. But in any event, we have with us Dr. Zaidi Sattar. Zaidi Sattar has been with us in our program previously, talking about trade policy in general. So Dr. Zaidi Sattar is an economist, trade economist. He was a civil servant turned trade economist, right, Dr. Sattar? So he was with the government. As a matter of fact, I didn't know. He was in pretty senior positions. He was a district magistrate, I believe, in Sylhet before he left for his doctoral studies in the United States. Taught for many years in the United States, and then he's now the chairman of Policy Research Institute of Bangladesh. He has many accomplishments. Notable amongst them is the 6th five-year plan, the 7th five-year plan of the government. He was instrumental in those, as well as the 2021 perspective plan, as well as the 2040 perspective plan. He has held many senior positions with World Bank. So we could spend a lot of time going through all of that, but let's just get into our program. Dr. Sattar, such a pleasure to have you. Very warm welcome.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you. This subject is a very contentious subject, actually, protectionism. Indeed. So there are pros and cons. So it's good to get a decent idea of where things stand.
Right. So the very first question that I would like to ask you, Dr. Sattar, and as you know, we are always limited in time. So let's go through. I have quite a few questions that I would like to ask you. My first one is, why need protection in the first place? And then the concept of infant industry. Would you just go through it quickly, please?
Okay, thank you very much. This is the pivotal question when it comes to protection, industrial protection. But to be fair, industrial protection is an idea that came with the idea of industrial development. If you want industrial development, particularly in developing countries, industries are typically new. You set up new industries and they need to be supported. So that is the principle. And the idea came in the post-war world when countries that were previously colonies were becoming independent, and they wanted to develop fast. They wanted to become rich like the other developed countries. So the idea was given to them. It was called a Prebisch-Singer hypothesis, that you need to protect your industries in order to industrialize. Okay, so and that is where the idea of infant industries comes in. Infant industry means an industry that is new and therefore will not be able to compete with established firms and established industries around the world. And the idea of protection comes in because of international trade. If you have established industries around the world and you are trying to set up an industry and there is no restriction on import, then the new industry will have difficulty to survive. That is what brought the idea of infant industries. Right. And they needed support. Now the question, how do you support infant industries? The argument goes that if infant industries are protected by tariffs, by other restrictions on imports, then over time they would learn by what is called learning by doing. They would become more familiar with the process and they will be able to reduce their costs of production. Once they are able to reduce their costs of production, then they can compete with the established players. But that raises several questions, and the questions are, how long does it take to become competitive with established players? And how much protection you would need? And how do you do that protection? So those are the issues that come up in the policy circles, and the research and the cross-country evidence seems to suggest, historical and cross-country evidence seem to suggest that once you have protection, industries tend to need more and more protection rather than less over time. And they become, in protection becomes ingrained in this atmosphere. And
Right.
then it's very difficult to scale back protection. And their vested interests also tend to come up around those protected industries. So it becomes very difficult.
Right. Dr. Sattar, in layman's term, let me see if I understand. So what you're basically saying is when a new industry gets started, obviously they don't have the economy of scale. They're not quite that efficient yet. They need some time to mature to be able to compete with other industries outside of the country. So they could come in and basically destroy your local industry. So to some extent, if I hear you correctly, there is some measure of protection needed for the industry, local industry to mature on one hand. And then of course, you're also saying that if it continues forever, then these industries take it for granted, become complacent, and then in effect become inefficient. So let me then move on to my next question, Dr. Sattar. What tools are generally used for to take these measures?
Good, thank you. That's a good one. There were more tools in the past, but we have this rules-based multilateral trading system under the WTO, under which some of those means of protection are now phased out, like curbing import, like putting import bans, putting quotas on imports for protecting domestic industries. These are gone. The only instrument now left, which is WTO compliant, are tariffs. Okay, so how do you protect domestic industries with tariffs? You impose high tariffs on imports, on competing imports. By imposing high tariffs on competing imports, the price of the imported good is very high, becomes higher, and then so the import is restricted. So the import competition becomes very limited. That's how industrial protection
I see.
is.
How do you see the tariff structure in Bangladesh? Would you care to elaborate?
That is another good question. Now, this is where people don't seem to have a good grasp. The textbook idea of tariffs means there is a custom duty. When you import something, there's a custom duty, and that custom duty is called the tariff. But Bangladesh has a fairly complex tariff structure. Custom duty is not the only tariff that is imposed on import. Now, on top of custom duties, we have a system of supplementary duties. Now, the title would suggest this is additional to custom duty, but these supplementary duties are imposed under a certain law, which is the VAT law. This is the VAT law that was introduced in 1992. And supplementary duties were, under the law, supposed to be trade neutral, meaning it is imposed on imports as well as domestic production equally. VAT, for its value-added tax, is a trade neutral tax in the sense that it is imposed equally on imports at a rate of 15% and also on similar domestic production at 15%. It's a trade neutral, it is not protected. Supplementary duty was supposed to be a trade neutral tax, that it would not serve as an instrument of protection. But our researchers show that 90% of supplementary duty in Bangladesh tend to be protective. Not only that, but it turns out that when there is a general supplementary duty of 20% for all sectors that are protected, some of the sectors get extra protection through supplementary duties.
So in effect, Dr. Sattar, what you're saying is SB, supplementary duty, then acts basically becomes like an import tariff. In effect, that's exactly what it becomes, right? So
yes,
if it
augments the import tariff.
Right. Doesn't matter what name you call it, but if it is uneven, then it basically becomes an import tariff.
Protective. It becomes a protective tariff, and we call them para-tariffs in the economics jargon.
Yeah, Dr. Sattar. So
Yes.
these para-tariffs, so-called
Yes.
para-tariffs, how does the World Trade Organization look at them?
The World Trade Organization now, every 3 years they have a trade policy review for every country, that member. So Bangladesh trade policy review, the last one was in 2019. They looked at you see, there are so many research going on, and the reports go to the World Trade Organization. They do not recognize the others because each country has different, trade levies, taxes and levies. As long as there are custom duties, WTO can recognize, okay, this is the level of custom duty. So what the WTO does is, in its trade policy review, it tells government of Bangladesh that, look, you've got these para-tariffs, you better take note of that they are not legal. For instance, once we graduate out of LDC status, those para-tariffs will become the focus. Other countries will say, oh, you've got these extra tariffs, these are not legitimate. These are not legit, so you better bring them down, remove them.
Right.
So as long as we are LDCs, they have WTO as well as the other, competitors, they've ignored. They basically look the other way. But that's not going to happen as we graduate out of LDC status. Things are going to get a bit more.
Right. So tell me, Dr. Sattar, how much protection do you think is the right amount of protection? That's one. And then, of course, I would want to know is how long that ought to be there, that protection.
What would be the level of protection? What should it be with the help of 25% tariff or a 50% tariff or 100% tariff? Nor did it say how long, this protection is going to last. Okay, so that would have to be left to the policymakers and the countries concerned. Now, the World Trade Organization and its predecessor, GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, they were on a mission to reduce tariffs around the world. And indeed, countries around the world have reduced their tariffs. But unfortunately, I think Bangladesh also did it. In the 1990s, tariffs were much higher, so they have brought it down. Trouble is, other countries brought it down much faster. So Bangladesh average, even just pure customs duty, the average is still double that of the average of lower middle income countries. That's not to mention, if you add the para-tariffs, it will be double that. So Bangladesh is among the higher tariff countries. Now, the other question is, how long are you going to continue putting 100% tariff? What the current situation is that every consumer good that is produced in Bangladesh, manufacturing consumer, that is subject to the highest tariff rate of 25%, custom duty. And then on top of that, there is a supplementary duty of 20%, and then some products get much higher. So you've got all the goods that you're producing domestically, consumer goods, and 90% of our in manufacturing production is consumer.
Right.
So they are all protected by the highest tariff rate, custom duty of 25%, plus supplementary duty, plus regular duty. So we've got to address that. Question is if the presumption of producers is that, okay, we've got this protection and this has to continue. And they have an argument. I can tell you what their argument. They'll say, oh, look, Bangladesh has such, we have inefficient governance. There's so much customs administration is still not as efficient, and we have so much delays. Transportation is not good. Port facilities are bad. So we need, some extra cover. That cover comes from tariffs. The answer to that question is that if you have infrastructure problems, if you've got power problems, power shortages, you have to address them with, investing in infrastructure, investing in improving customs administration, improving transportation, and so on. Tariff is not the answer to, It's not the solution to those problems. For instance, you put a high tariff on tableware, imported tableware, or then what happens is the imported tableware, you know, price is 100% more than what you find in the international market. But the domestic tableware, which is a substitute of that imported thing, that price also goes up, not necessarily exactly by 100, but somewhat less, because the domestic product is not a perfect substitute. In the absence of the domestic product being a perfect substitute, the price effect of the tariff is not 100%. It's slightly less. I mean, that's a practicality.
Obviously, if I understand what you're saying is, if the imported product with the taxes and stuff comes out to be 100% more than the local product also then they find that room to increase their price, not quite
Absolutely.
go up to that. So consumers end up paying that overall price hike. That's what you're basically saying, right?
Yes, consumers pay a higher price for the imported, let's say a toothpaste that will cost 50 taka. Because of the tariff, you are paying 100 taka for the imported product. And the domestic toothpaste, which is similar to the import, you'll be paying 75 taka. But actually, it should be 50 taka.
Right.
The domestic, but you're paying 75 taka, you're paying 100 taka for the imported one. So all that is fine, but here's what my problem, and here's a problem that policymakers have. Because you protect continuously, perpetually, and at a high rate compared to your competitors, this protection hurts or undermines the export incentives. I take the ready-made garments out of this thing because ready-made garments are 100% export-oriented. They import inputs at zero tariff. They are at enclave arrangement. But all the other products, manufacturing products that we produce, they are producing for the domestic market. They are also selling their products abroad as export. But then, if you have these protective tariffs ranging from minimum protection I've seen is 56%, and then it goes up to 113% and so on and so forth. So if you have such high protection, this is nothing but an indirect subsidy on import substitute production. You are producing agro-processed food processing products. You're producing plastic goods. You're producing footwear, leather products, and other things. Now, all of this, are exportable. But then the incentive to exporting is a very difficult, responsibility. You have to open markets. You have to keep running. You have to do a lot of legwork in order to capture an export market and then sustain it. And once you capture an export market, the market is vast. You have the whole world market too. But that is where, if your domestic market is very highly protected, the tendency will be to produce for the domestic market and ignore exports. And that is bad for the future. That is bad for the future. And then domestic consumers, poor consumers, what will they do? They end up paying 100%, 75% more than international prices for all the consumer goods they buy. And Bangladesh middle class is growing. We have a growing middle class, and the middle class is paying 75% to 100% above international prices for most consumer goods. Not to mention the fact that this high tariff also restricts choice. You don't have much choice. Consumers who have the money, who travel abroad, they go and buy things from abroad and bring it to Bangladesh. But when you go to the market, you have to pay a very high price.
Right,
So
absolutely.
This is
absolutely. Dr. Sattar, so what you're basically saying is protection basically is a tax on the consumers, right?
Yeah,
and very simply put, it goes to, it's just common sense that if the local producer is artificially protected and protected forever, then that producer has basically no interest in going and competing for lesser price abroad. Because because the same products are more competitive abroad. And if he has to export, then he has to produce at that level, at that price. And if he gets higher price locally, why should he go for export? So that brings me to a question, Dr. Sattar, something that I had discussed with you in previous occasions as well, that that is primarily the reason why we are failing to diversify our export basket. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I think that is one of the reasons why we're not getting any traction in export diversification. Ready-made garments is doing very well, and it is expected to do very well. And the market is out there for ready-made garments, no problem. But when it comes to non-ready-made garment export, non-garment export, we have comparative advantage in this sector, non-garment, because our comparative advantage comes from our labor, low-cost labor, okay? And there are many other labor-intensive products which we export. In fact, when you count the number of export products at the 6-digit HS code level, we exported 1,400 of these 6-digit HS products beyond ready-made garments. Number of products is huge. And many of these, we are highly competitive in the international market. But the incentive, you have to have the incentive to export. You have to run around, you have to do the legwork, you have to open markets and then, try to keep those markets. But there's no protection in export. Unless, the government starts giving cash subsidy, then it's limited. There's a lot of cash subsidy being given to exports from 5% to 20%. But that is no match to the indirect subsidy that domestic market provides, because the protective tariff is in 85%, 100%, and so on. So 5 to 20%, cash subsidy, and even some concessional loans that are given to exporters, that doesn't match the high protection in the domestic market, which raises the profitability of the domestic sales much more. Absolutely. Domestic sales are much more profitable.
Absolutely. Yeah, Dr. Sattar, I think what we have covered today, albeit brief, but we have actually unearthed, or for a vast majority of the people, that do not really understand the very simple principle as to how this whole thing works and what we ought to do moving forward. So just to wrap it up, Dr. Sattar, basically what we're saying is, as we start an industry, and that industry is an infant industry, then there are some measures that are needed to protect that industry for it to mature. Now, what you're saying basically is that's fine, but that cannot continue forever. If it does, then obviously consumers pay that higher price, and not to mention the fact that, those industries then slowly but surely become inefficient. I guess with that, we'll have to wrap it up, Dr. Sattar. As always, what a pleasure it is. And, I hope our audience understand and appreciate the fact that, they're able to listen to one of the finest minds as far as trade policy goes in Bangladesh. In any event, Dr. Sattar, thank you so much for joining us. And I thank our audience for joining us as well, with an invitation to join us in the next session. While you stay safe, we'll catch you soon. Bye-bye.